The original Night of the Living Dead was about immediate survival against zombies. They were a threat that could kill you within the next few minutes or next few hours, but it wasn't a long-term problem. But immediate threat is just one aspect of it, because the idea of the zombie apocalypse is often not about the immediate threat, the dead banging at your door. It's the apocalypse because the system comes crashing down. Some works, like Dawn of the Dead, took it to the logical next step. You survive the immediate threat, then what? You need to consider the long term. After all, just about any two-story structure can provide immediate protection if you just collapsed to the stairs or pulled up the ladder. But then what? You can't stay on the second floor of some old house indefinitely. Sooner or later, you're going to need food and water, or you're only going to die in a different way. This leads to the idea of raiding stockpiles, like stores and warehouses and even abandoned homes, scavenging for what you need to survive. That can buy you some time. But while it might seem grand, setting up your shelter and daringly getting supplies, scavenging isn't a permanent solution either. Sooner or later, food will spoil, and what doesn't will run out. That's not unique to zombie apocalypse. That's true of any fall of civilization, because it's civilization that makes the machinery that puts that food there for you to take. Maybe you can hold out for months or even years, but eventually, it's going to run out. Eventually, you're going to starve to death unless you rebuild the machine. What we see in the next section of World War Z is life amidst the zombie domination of the planet. In a curious move, none of this is set in the besieged areas of the planet, those struggling daily against the onslaughts by the living dead. It's about dealing with the long-term survival issue, not the immediate or short-term ones. And nothing shows the world turned on its head quite like the difference between the United States and Cuba. For starters, everything east of the Rocky Mountains was abandoned to the zombies. The safe zone was everything west of that, which has to be cleared of its own infestations in major cities. The U.S. capital is now in Honolulu, and the situation so dire that the president was sedated due to bite or perhaps having gone into shock at the fact that his bandaged solutions and attempts to get the big win in Yonkers had backfired into losing two-thirds of the country. Cuba, on the other hand, had quickly cracked down on infection and immigration so that it was completely safe and intact, and ironically had people escaping from the U.S. to the island instead of the other way around. Cuba could have wound up like Iceland, which was overrun by refugees after the U.S. military pulled out, and because it didn't have the forces to defend itself, it became so overrun that it remains one of the most infected areas on the planet, even 10 years after the end of the war in America. The result of the influx of refugees was unexpected. Effectively, these people became slaves of the state, working the fields on state farms. But eventually they could start working for a pittance on a special release program that would integrate them into Cuban society, until eventually they became the new working class, while the native Cubans started getting a taste for this new lifestyle, until eventually more capitalism and more freedoms were being demanded, until Cuba had been transformed into a completely democratic economic powerhouse. After the way capitalism seemed to take a beating in the early book, this may come as a surprise, but I'll get into more detail in that in the next part as to why it does fit the overall themes of the book. In the U.S., things were desperate. The machinery of our civilization had worked so well that the majority of citizens had jobs that were of no practical use without it, that were ridiculous without it, actually. For instance, a man is mentioned whose job it was to get the rights to classic rock songs for commercials. In a world without intellectual property, or ads, or even products to sell, that might as well be unicorn groomer. A new machine was necessary simply for the sake of survival, and with two goals: to create self-sustaining communities, and to prepare for the day when they had to reclaim the country from the living dead. To achieve both those ends, the Department of Strategic Resources is set up, and in complete contrast to Cuba, goes effectively Marxist. Private property had to be surrendered for the greater good. Your citrus groves needed to be turned into fields of crops. Your herds of cattle were needed to help feed the starving, and so your fields can feed people instead of cows. Your cars needed to be turned into spare parts for the war machines. Your houses need to make room for displaced families, and you had to take on jobs that were unthinkably menial if you didn't have important skills. Cleaning toilets and working on production lines, even if you were a millionaire just a few months ago. And punishments had regressed. Stocks, whippings. Yet all of it was completely logical. Things were teetering on the edge of total collapse, and the only way to survive was to think about the greater good first. The punishments, for instance, while barbaric, were the only choice in a place where imprisonment and rehabilitation were just plain impractical. You couldn't let crime go unpunished or the system would collapse in days. But locking up able-bodied people and guarding them with other able-bodied people was a drain on resources that couldn't be afforded when every resource was needed for their very survival. Like the Rediker plan, which said you needed to abandon the things you had and consolidate to survive, the social makeup was operating the same. You had to abandon the luxuries, economic and social, that we had and focus instead on the area of survival. The thing that prevented America from completely devolving into a northern banana republic was that the democratic system was left untouched, that the newly sworn-in president, and it's strongly implied that Colin Powell is now president, with Howard Dean as his appointed vice president, would keep elections in place and work to resolve things peacefully unless it was an imminent threat. People didn't turn over their property at gunpoint. It was a quid pro quo. The price for protection from zombies, looters, rapists, and starvation was to surrender that property necessary to keep the government in place that is protecting you from zombies, looters, etc. That's not to say the United States had given up on capitalism and its independent spirit. One of the things Arthur Sinclair, who ran D-Stress, the short for Department of Strategic Resources, one of the things he kept was the label for a bottle of root beer with the ingredients and where it all comes from. All the international trade necessary to make that one thing. It shows the essential need for the commerce that was being choked off by the war with the undead. But also, it serves as a metaphor for the situation they found themselves in. The only way for this thing to exist is for all these different things to come together. You don't have them all, and it's spoiled. After the war, it was his job, after transforming America into a Marxist paradise, to change it back into a capitalist society again, restore trust in money, bring back the markets, both Main Street and Wall Street, even sorting out legitimate money from stuff that had been looted during the war. Seems an impossible task to get back to that, but Sinclair symbolically shows it can happen by, as the last thing he says in the book, offering the narrator a root beer. While the United States was portrayed in the pre-war as short-sighted by the authorities, private industry, and the population, the safe zone is shown mobilizing as a unified front. Even citizen patrols being formed up to deal with zombies, looters, and ferals. Children like the girl who escaped the church, who survived, but without adult guidance and social interaction became practically wild animals. With the war over, they are trying to claw their way back to the way it was. I don't mean messed up, but the way of life. Brooks presents America as a flawed country, but when its back is against the wall, comes together and marshals its strength to prevail against it. That the system is flexible enough to undergo such a crisis and emerge just as strong on the other side. This is notably absent from the perspective of other nations. The leadership of China failed to have the flexibility necessary to weather this. So, accustomed to facing down adversaries with their incomprehensibly large population, and thus bottomless well of manpower, they're facing an enemy where their numbers swell the more yours are lost. That just didn't sink in. The incompetence on display eventually leads to the collapse of Three Gorges Dam. And if you want to know how significant that is, the reservoir it created was so large it actually slowed the rotation of the Earth slightly. The dam's collapse and the spin doctoring the leadership employed led to a civil war, one which only ended with the use of a bunker buster against the headquarters of the old regime. The new government would be completely democratic, just like Cuba. Oh, and the irony there. Three Gorges Dam was also what might have started this whole thing. Remember the moon fishing that boy did when he got infected? That might be how all of these people got infected in the first place. So the government sets up this dam, and in the end, that dam's destruction is what leads to their own downfall. The opposite happened in Russia. The decimation showed their mockery of democracy, but the effect was to make the soldiers loyal to the bitter end. Except there was one thing they couldn't make them do because of it. When a soldier is bitten, it's a death sentence. What's worse, they will become the very enemy they were supposed to fight. So the bitten, needed to die. But you couldn't order the soldiers to kill their comrades even as a mercy killing. Discipline had been enforced by making them all murderers. If that order came down, no amount of decimations would ever restore order. The officers couldn't do it either. They tried it, but it had too great of a psychological impact and wound up driving them to suicide. So suicide seemed the only answer that they had. A priest, however, decided it was the duty of the church to take up the burden, to put the bitten out of their misery and prevent them from being damned for suicide. The president of Russia used this movement to adjust the culture into a theological kingdom which he dubbed the Holy Russian Empire. So one of the themes of World War Z is that the corruption of totalitarian regimes, or just plain corrupt nations, cannot survive the zombie war. The people will compel them to change one way or another. Democratic countries otherwise emerge intact. The United Kingdom section, for instance, discusses the nobility and leadership of the Queen, but while she is praised for her invaluable contributions with both resources and moral support, they don't go back to being a monarchy. Two opposing extremes are also seen, North Korea and Japan. No one is interviewed from North Korea. The observations are entirely from an outsider who notes that if any nation was built to weather the storm of the undead, it was North Korea. It held only one border with another nation that didn't have a natural boundary to it, and that is the most heavily defended border on Earth. And the population had become unquestioning in their devotion to their leader. And yet with the crisis, they seem to have vanished from the face of the earth. It's believed that they all went underground to weather the crisis, and either the leader decided to just keep them down there forever in a place where he had total control, or else, and this is far more likely, someone infected got inside, and the entire population are now zombies waiting for the day when someone opens those doors. But while North Korea is described as a nation bred for war, Japan is considered the exact opposite. Their military is small, their police don't have guns, and their islands are overpopulated. There simply wasn't the firepower to exterminate the zombie population. The only choice for them was to evacuate. The state of Japan is shown by a young otaku who cuts himself off from the world with his online pursuit, but is nevertheless forced in the end to stand up and look out for himself. Also, an elderly blind man who is waiting to die instead finds himself killing zombies in the park as a way of purifying nature. North Korea was so fixated on war it was likely their downfall, while Japan's was being so unconcerned that they were caught flat-footed. But through these two individuals, we see that the spirit of Japan to stand up and restore itself still remains strong. Finally worth mentioning is the practice of exile. As with decimations and whippings, it was an ancient punishment that had come back in vogue. The Attorney General proposed it in America, but was shot down by both the VP and the President. The VP because it was wrong to deliberately send people out to be eaten alive no matter what they had done. But the President had a far more practical reason that Europe later learned. Prisons are dangerous places, so hardened criminals quickly learn to be even more alert for threats and become more capable of taking them down. They become more resourceful and concoct clever improvised weapons in order to do it. Now drop those people in an area full of threats, but also full of abandoned cities filled with resources, and what you have are the nastiest people on earth being given everything they need to turn a gang of thugs into newfound conquerors. This proved so successful for them that by the time the country that exiled them came back to reclaim their territory, these fiefdoms were so strong they actually drove them off. As the president had said, they could have wound up going up against the High Emperor of Duluth or something. And when you're fighting the living dead, it's very hard to find the manpower to fight a conventional war against a force that by its very nature is devoid of any sense of morality. Yet, how moral can any society be that would sentence anyone to be torn apart by zombies? Even in Cuba, which used the threat of throwing disobedient slaves into zombie pits, never actually did that. Yeah, even the regime that turned refugees into slaves knew better. And that's why they became an economic superpower and not the site of a crazed and desperate revolution. All of these tie into the larger theme of the book, which is the importance of the independent spirit. Countries where this was forfeited to the government, like in North Korea, or when it was forfeited to outside protectors, like Japan and Iceland, they had their way of life collapse. Russia became a theocracy as they gradually surrendered their will to the state. In other places, revolution or evolution led to the transformation to the independent democratic nations. Even the criminals that set up their fiefdoms are a sign of how their independent spirits could carve out their own private kingdoms in the midst of an infestation that governments couldn't stop. America is the only country to take a weird deviation in this, the importance of the collective good, yet going back to its old way of life. But this seems to be because America is perceived as the personification of the independent spirit in this book. The change that takes place is the equivalent of the action hero in the popular movies who, having been beaten down in the second reel, struggles back to his feet, rolls up his sleeves, and returns to give it even worse right back to the villain. Next time, a further look at life during this period with Individualism and Unity.